Today's wild broadcast. What I thought we'd do today is we'd have a quick wander around along one of the routes where I do every week a formal butterfly survey. Explain that method that we use and use it as an excuse to have a bit of a wander around the site and see some of the site as well. So the method we're talking about is something called a butterfly transect, and I'll explain a little bit more as we get going how that works. But the first thing we would do if we were doing this walk properly would be to check the temperature and the wind speed and the wind direction. So what we would normally do, sort of survey, you would check what the temperature is on the thermometer here, 21 degrees. Make a note of that normally. And then the wind force, tend to assess it on the Beaufort scale, which is although it maps onto wind speeds properly, it's a slightly subjective one, and this is probably about a wind force 3, I would reckon. And I would use the weather vane up there to check the wind direction, which is southwesterly. So that would give just a bit of contextual data for the survey. And then the way this survey works is you walk a fixed route once a week during the butterfly recording season, which is essentially start of April to the end of September. And you would record any butterflies you see on that fixed route within a sort of a between 2.5 meters each way and in front of you. So it's controlling a lot of the effort that's made in making the data usefully comparable. And we're going to walk around the route that I would use for doing that butterfly survey. Have a look at the different habitats it goes through and point out anything we do manage to see. So just going through the gate into the paddock, one of the areas of grassland. This is an area that we manage by having grazed relatively late in the season, so it's sort of our late grazed meadow. And the grazing and sometimes cutting as well is a way of just keeping the grasses down and allowing some of the flowers that opportunity to develop. So you can see quite a few flowers in here. There are lots of buttercups, lots of clover, various other flowers as well. That I'm not particularly focusing on flowers today, unless they've got insects perched on them. But we continue along this route. There's a butterfly. The meadow brown butterfly just dropped in here somewhere. Probably see it about in the centre of the screen there. A very common butterfly in grasslands and meadows. But obviously that's interesting. So there we go. That's our first butterfly that we saw on this walk. And if we were doing this as a proper recording method, we'd have made a note of that, keep track of it. Something else flying here. It's a small copper butterfly. So perched on one of these buttercups in the centre of the screen again. So we'll go in a bit closer. Again, small copper. Doesn't seem to want it to focus, but there we go. So by doing this method and by recording only these ones that are in this sort of defined box around us, what we're making sure we're doing with these methods is recording in a very standardized way. And that lets the data be used to study the trends in the population of particularly the butterflies. We do also gather moth data if we see any, and indeed any other invertebrates that we see. And theoretically, I suspect the moth data would be sufficiently robust, as would probably data on dragonflies recorded on this, to allow similar methodologies. For other insects, the search image parameters, the search parameters might just be a bit different what you see. So it may not be, if you're doing a walk, focused and tuned into the sort of lepidopteran thing, that you would necessarily be able to draw conclusions about other types of invertebrate numbers from this. There's something. So this, I'm pretty sure, was a brown argus. It just flew away though. One of the blue butterflies, in that it's in the family called the blues, but it has no blue scales on it in this group, in this species, the brown argus. It was all just brown. So this is taking us up, further up the paddock, all on this standard route that we walk along, recording any butterflies that we've seen, to some extent paying a fair amount of attention to the camera and to the phone and to the broadcast rather than the actual butterflies. Here's a moth, Burnet companion moth, one of the commoner moths that you get in this grassland at this time of year. Do superficially resemble one of the skipper butterflies, and sometimes they get misreported as as a species called the dingy skipper, but they are a moth. Again, I would record them on this survey if we were doing it properly, make sure that they get recorded as well and all that data gets submitted. And the data we gather from these formal walks gets submitted to something called the Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. It's a scheme where there are people doing essentially this sort of survey in lots of sites around the country, very large numbers, gathering this data. It all feeds into a national scheme which allows some quite robust statistical analysis to be done to understand the trends in the different species. So it's all really useful, and it's a significant, essentially amateur volunteer effort. Citizen science tends to be the term we call it now, although we were doing this long before we called this thing citizen science. And if you tot up the amount of hours, I do 2 of these around here. If we call them half an hour each, that's an hour. That's 26 hours I will put in as a minimum doing these surveys locally. Now, if you're having to pay for that effort from someone, professional ecologist or someone sufficiently trained to be able to do the butterfly identifications, you wouldn't be able to do many of them in the country on any plausible budget. So tapping into the enthusiastic amateurs like myself who are happy to do this because they enjoy it, do it because of fun, that means you can focus that limited resource you've got for professional ecologists on much more specialist things that really take advantage of their professional skill set. And the level of recording that's done, I say there are many hundreds, possibly thousands of these transects done in the UK every year. That would tot up to a significant amount of money if you costed it out. The significant value of natural history volunteering. So the survey will continue. It, as you see, has now gone into the edge of the woodland. It doesn't particularly go to the centre of the woodland anywhere, but it touches the edges a few times. Again, to try and get a coverage of a bit of the variety of the habitat that the site has got. The other thing I'd be noting on each bit of the walk, it's sort of broken up into slightly arbitrary segments, 10 in the case of this site, is what percentage of the time the sun was shining on each segment. So again, that combined with the temperature data and the wind data that we talked about at the start is just giving some extra useful variables for people who are making use of this data to analyse the butterflies, to help understand, control a little bit for local conditions. So if it's a cold day without much sunshine, there might be less flying. And if we've gathered that data, that means that usefully they can use that information to see whether the low numbers on a particular walk are genuinely low or are reflecting the weather. Again, some quite sophisticated analysis is done by the monitoring scheme, and it produces some really useful national data. Coming up here to something we're not particularly going to look at on this walk is a pheromone lure for in this case it's a phone. I'm not sure if that's what we caught in here. You can possibly see one of the moths in there. I will come back to that and have a look. Big patch of nettles here. Again, good larval food source for some of the commoner species. So we'll go up here onto the top of what we call the mound. A bit more open habitat and somewhat different tree structures to the trees and plants to the ones that were in the wood. So again, the route was deliberately chosen to try and thread through a few of the different habitats that we have here in the site. Another little moth here, let's see if it'll settle. There's a little micro moth here, flew off again. It was a nettle tap, Anthophila fabriciana is the scientific name. They're a common species. The larvae feed on nettles, which are these stinging plants here. And we usually see them in quite good numbers, particularly in this bit of the site. down the other side of the mound now. And then we're going to turn right here. So again, this would be the fixed route. Obviously, if I was doing this survey properly, I'd have a net. There's another nettle tap. Let's have a look at that. Let's try zooming in this way. There's your nettle tap moth. Rather an attractive thing. One of the metal marks is the sort of common name given to the group that they're in. Rather an attractive species. Tiny little thing, really. Probably about, I don't know, 8 millimeters wing length, perhaps. Not the smallest of moths, but nevertheless. But quite a few of them, again, around these nettles. And they'd be made note of and recorded on the transect form. And again, that data would go in. At the moment, not all the transect walkers do record the moths that they see. So the moth data isn't actively used in the same way that the butterfly data is, but it goes in and it's usefully captured there. And I think, well, I hope with a little bit of thought in the design of the data submission, they could find ways that data could be made use of. If people will just indicate when they've done these surveys whether they have recorded any moths they've seen, whether they've recorded all the moths they've seen and been able to identify. That would allow that data to be extracted and made use of, I think. So that would be one of the suggestions I would make to the scheme. It's a speckled wood butterfly. Let's see if it'll settle anywhere. Might be going to settle down. There we go. Speckled wood butterfly on this fairly large leaf ahead of us. Go a bit closer and then I'll zoom in. Well, I won't zoom in digitally because it's flown away. And another common woodland species. The male's often defending a sort of little sunny patch, waiting for females and chasing off any other males. And this bit of the track runs alongside the boundary stream where the water enters the reserve. I haven't particularly looked at watery habitat in the design of this transect. Haven't gone by any of the ponds particularly, because there's not really a butterfly association with ponds in any useful way. So it wasn't something I designed in when I put this route together. But this does go along the edge of the stream, and it does go along this path, which is, again, quite an interesting little bit at the edge of the reserve. And off to the right is just outside, over here is just outside the banks, the bounds of the reserve. It's the banks of the Royal Mail's Greenford Depot. But they agreed when they developed their site that they would essentially leave it as semi-wild space and a sort of buffer and barrier to us here. So it's unofficially an extension of the logic of the reserve here. But it's technically owned by the Royal Mail rather than the Selborne Society, who own the nature reserve itself. But it provides, again, a bit of sort of scrubby, rough habitat, not particularly actively managed by us or by them. Along this little section of the reserve later in the year is where we have a small colony of a somewhat unusual butterfly called the white letter hair streak. It's associated with elm, which is a much declined tree species, and it spends most of its time up in the canopy of the trees. So it's not a species that this transect method that we use here, which is obviously necessarily at ground level, is particularly well designed for monitoring and surveying. We do get them on the transect and useful data can be extracted from it, but because of their behaviour they're a slightly different species. Difficult species to monitor in this way. It's a little early in the year for them to be out now, so I'm not particularly expecting we'd have seen one. And this is worth mentioning as part of the reserve. So again, coming up to this bit of the edge of the reserve, which is an area where there is quite a bit of elm. Young, immature elm, because the mature elm doesn't survive these days. And again, coming out now to the edge of the wood, a bit more light, a bit more open. Some more open patches here. Again, part of how we manage the reserve is we cut some of the elm and scrub on a rotation in these areas. So this was cut probably last year, hence it's quite open. And as we go further down, it was cut later on, is therefore less open. And again, that variety is really important. It's having a variety in different habitat types, shade and exposed areas with sunlight is all very helpful for maintaining a diversity of species and a diversity of habitats. Right, we're going to go now into one of the meadows. This bit of the site is closed off to visitors at the moment because we have cattle grazing it, but if we know to do the survey, we go to there. There's a brimstone butterfly. Let's see if we can see that. Bright yellow butterfly that flew briefly into the screen there. I'm going to climb over this gate, so this could be a bit wobbly for a moment. Bear with me as I go down. And unlike the other meadow, this is the meadow that we have grazed early in the year. And you can see therefore, because we've got the cows in at the moment, we'll probably see them in a moment. But there they are. Well, there's 3 of them anyway, sitting in the shade there. You see that the grass here is much lower than it was in the other meadow. So this one we graze early, and then we probably, when we take them out and put them into the meadow, let it come back a bit more and then look at whether we need to do an additional mechanical cut on this site. It's a discussion for the future. And again, if we go down here, we'd be making a note of any butterflies we've seen, any other insects. All of that would then get submitted on a, well, these days it's done via a website. It used to be a paper form that we filled in and then posted off every year. And then there was a period when there was a particular software program you downloaded that you put all the data into and then emailed a copy of the records to people. It's all done online now, which has the advantage that as soon as you've submitted, as soon as you've entered your data, it's available to the researchers using it, rather than having to wait until the end of the year. For the main use that's made of this, which is looking at annual population trends, of course they do need the full year's data before they do anything. But for some other uses, it can be done much more quickly. So that really helps. And then we've cut along here some very nice old hawthorns here, particularly a species with a butterfly association as such, but a nice, probably relic of an old hedge line of some kind, I suspect, that's not been maintained as a hedge and has grown into a few large standing hawthorns. Interesting. Nice to see sort of mature versions of that tree, because quite often with it being a hedgerow tree, it doesn't get that big as a comma butterfly. See if we can get closer to that. There we go. Nice orange coloured wings, and with you might be able to see a little white comma shaped mark on the hind wing. Right, here we go. So we'll go into the final stretch of this transect. This will be the final segment, some 10 of the 10 segments. I've not been particularly pointing out the segments as we do this walk because they're not of much interest to anyone but me doing the survey. But by dividing the site into different segments, it makes the monitoring a bit easier, and it makes the data entry work a bit better. There's no particular reason for the standard use that's made of this data why we couldn't do it just as one big long walk. Right, another gate to climb over here. Just bear with me. There we go. We'll go along this last section. Bridle way we call this, the thinking being this was originally a track used by horses, although it's not formally designated as a bridle way. I don't think it ever has been. And obviously there's no public access, so people can't really ride their horses along here even if they wanted to. Another one of the white butterflies. Let me see which one it is. See if it'll settle. So this would be one of the challenges in these walks. You have to identify the species. And the white butterflies, there's a few rather similar ones. You can usually get enough of the relevant feature. I'm pretty sure that one was small white. Again, doing the transect properly, I would probably have a net with me to allow me to grab one or two of the more tricky things and just confirm the identification so that the data is useful. Right, just give me a second. It's one of our other visiting volunteers. So there we go, that takes us to the end of the transect route that we're doing. So I will drop off the broadcast here. Quick wander around, have a look at what was there. So yeah.